I'd like to discuss perhaps 3 of your 20 volumes, and I'd like to touch on Three Stones, which I believe is based on Saram's older work, God's Graves and Scholars, and then just move to Digging Deeper, which is about the techniques used for archaeology and some of the newer techniques, which I think will interest readers because things have changed somewhat in archaeology today. And then perhaps we could just move to 1177, which is, I know, everyone's absolute favorite, and also another book that you're writing following up on that. So I was just wondering if we could just touch on Three Stones and then just move to Digging Deeper. Could you explain a little bit about how you came to write that book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, Three Stones Make a Wall came about because my editor at Princeton, Rob Tempio, he basically said to me, I think it's time for a new version of C.W. Saram's God's Graves and Scholars. And I said, yeah, I completely agree. I grew up reading that book. I mean, a lot of us did, but it came out in the 1950s, and the revised edition was in the 1960s, and that was it. So it's a good 50 years out of date. There have been a lot of things that have been found since then, and there were a lot of sites that Saram did not talk about for one reason or another. So I agreed. I thought it would be fun, and I wanted to aim it particularly at a couple of groups, not professional archaeologists, not peers and colleagues, because not only do they already know it, they're already also teaching it. So if anything, I would be hoping they would use it maybe as a textbook for their students. But I was aiming at it at kids like myself, ages 7 to 17, that think they're fascinated by archaeology, don't really know much about it, want to find out more, and want something that's accessible. So I thought that was a group I wanted to aim for. The other group was armchair archaeologists, especially people who always wanted to be archaeologists, but whose parents told them, no, you have to do something that will earn a living. You have to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or whatever, something that's going to make you money. But that write to me now and say, I always kind of regret I didn't go into archaeology. And so I thought, well, let me write a book that they can read and enjoy as well. And then my third group were people that were actually going to head out on excavations for themselves. And so that's where actually in Three Stones, there are these intervening chapters called Digging Deeper. How do you know where to go? How do you know how to dig? How do you know how old something is? And so after the book had been out a year or two, I think it came out in 2017, Rob Tempio came back to me and said, I think we should take the Digging Deeper chapters, pull them out, and make it a small book on its own, a little book that you can literally carry in your pocket for the people that aren't that interested in knowing about Machu Picchu or Pompeii, but they do want to know how you're going to go digging. And so I said, sure, and actually that would be great because there was a chapter I did not include in Three Stones because we were already way over the limit in terms of words that he had given me. And so I said, I've got a whole nother chapter that I wrote that we never put in that could go in this spin-off. And so that's where the Digging Deeper book came from. It's basically a spin-off from Three Stones. And that is meant specifically for people who have either never gone digging and wanted to know how to do it, or were about to go on their first dig and wanted to know what to expect. And, for $10, you can pick this up and then have some idea. So on your first day at the dig, you don't feel quite as much of a newbie. You're like, oh yeah, I read that. Yeah, I remember that. So that was kind of the impetus for that. So those two books are related, and they really were aimed at getting people interested in the field, getting people who were already interested to know a bit more, and to satisfy the urgings of the people who were never able to do it. So a big audience there, but I had a lot of fun writing it.
Yes. Now, I believe that you've had something like 30 seasons of digging yourself. Is that correct? Yeah. I recognize you mainly from the documentaries I've watched over the years, and you always seem to be in Israel, I think, at least at least when I was watching you. And it was later on that I came to read your books. But you're coming from an immense wealth of experience, and I was interested to read in digging deeper that you still use the pick and trowel about 80% of the time. Is that correct? Still.
Yeah.
Whereas there's also a new type of archaeology which also interested me, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because there were things such as satellite photography. Sarah Parkak is the new person in that space with her satellite archaeology, and magnetometers, things like isotopic analysis, that type of thing is now coming into archaeology, whereby you have experts. And I was actually thinking that there was more of a chance of people becoming involved in archaeology, maybe not full time, but maybe a scientist, for instance, could be hired for a particular part of a dig. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, yeah, so let me go back. Yeah, if you were watching me in the early videos, most of mine were in Israel. You're quite right. I think I was on one where I was on Crete, but everything else was in the Middle East. Yeah. So taking those and taking the experiences I've had in the field, you're right. I've been on, I think, more than 30 seasons of digging now, which I think is pretty typical for a professional archaeologist about my age. We start going in the field in our 20s. By the time you hit the big 6-0 where I am now, if you've gone every summer, that's what you do. Yes. But so in Three Stones Make a Wall, what I wanted to do was to bring that personal experience to life. C.W. Saram, in his God's Graves and Scholars, which is a great book and still a great read, he's not an archaeologist, he's a journalist. And so he was reporting what other people did. So what I thought I could do was basically insert myself into the story, which I had been always taught, not to do, right? Keep yourself out of the story, impassionate, right? But I'm like, no, let me interject myself and give examples from my personal experience. What is it like to survey? What is it like to dig? And so, there are some people that I'm sure don't like it because we're like, we don't care about what you did. Just tell us about what happened in Pompeii, and I'm like, well, when I went to Pompeii, this is what I saw. But anyway, so it's definitely from my point of view, and telling both my experiences and those of others. Yes. And so as part of that, yes, I talked about what it's like to excavate using picks and shovels and trowels and brushes, which is what we mostly do in the Mediterranean region, from Italy to Greece to Egypt to the Levant. It'll be different, say, in northern New England, where if you dig with a pickaxe, you're going to go through all the levels of the site within an hour, and you'll have lost everything. Yes. There you're just scraping with the trowel. So I wanted to tell people what it was like and how to dig in different areas. But as you mentioned, there are now a lot of new technologies that have come into play, which, bear in mind, we still have to end up excavating. We still have to use the pick and the shovel and the pastiche and the trowel and all that. But a lot of the new technologies are helping us figure out where to dig and where not to dig. So, for example, you mentioned Sarah Parkak, the space archaeologist, Indy from space. And she and others are using satellite imagery and remote sensing to figure out where sites are that are not necessarily visible at ground level. Like if you and I are just walking over, an area with sand or trees or whatever, we wouldn't necessarily see the site. But from the satellite images, she can see them. So that's kind of an extreme example because she's using satellites. We've got other ones that are more readily available to, I would say, more people, where it varies from, it's all remote sensing basically, but you can either be doing it at ground level or a little bit higher, treetop level, or even higher than that. So just to give you some examples, and some of which you already mentioned, if you're at ground level, you can be using a magnetometer, for example, which will measure the Earth's magnetic field in that area. And if anybody has done anything that has disturbed the Earth in antiquity, dug a ditch, built a wall, whatever, it will have impacted the magnetic force, and you can use a magnetometer to trace what is there. Right. Similarly, you could use electric resistivity, where you put two poles into the ground and run an electric current between them. And if there is something like a wall or a building that will break the current, then that will show up on your diagram. And so you can do that. There's also ground penetrating radar, which works like radar does, except it's going into the ground. All of these are allowing us to see beneath the Earth before we ever start digging. So it can be a tremendous expense saver. If you can figure out that there's nothing there and it's not worth your time to dig, basically what I do, I refer to it as digging blind. These remote sensing techniques are allowing me not to have to dig blind. Right? When I'm excavating, it's so expensive, time and money and energy, that if I know there's going to be something underneath the area that I've pegged out, then that's worthwhile. So it's quite a bit of savings that way. The other thing that's come into play, and this is a bit more expensive, but if you've got the money, it's well worth it, is LiDAR. And you've seen these probably in the newspapers and such, where you would use it from, say, a helicopter or a Cessna airplane, right? Something that's small and relatively slow flying. And LiDAR, it's like radar. It's light emitting radar, essentially. Bounces off the surface of the ground back up to the aircraft, but it can see through vegetation. So you can use it down in South and Central America, in, say, Belize. You can see the Maya sites that are now overgrown by the jungle, but in LiDAR, you're looking at it as if the trees aren't even there. It's been used in Cambodia to look through the jungle there as well. And what most people don't realize, you can also use LiDAR at a terrestrial level, that is at ground level. And we did this, I actually think I put this into 3 stones. We did this at our site of Tel Kabri, up in the north of what's now modern Israel, ancient Canaan. And we found there an ancient wine cellar, almost 4,000 years old, oldest and largest that's ever been found in the Near East. The wine jars that we found our very first season in that wine cellar, we had 40 big jars, each of them about a meter tall, about 3 feet tall. It would have taken us 4, 5, 6 weeks to draw them in place, and we didn't have that type of time. But we called in a team that had a LiDAR instrument, and they set it up in the middle of the room, started it going, and within 3 hours, they had mapped the entire room with hundreds of thousands of data points that we could then slice and dice. And that was it. They showed up at 1 p.m., packed up by 4, sent us the stuff the next day, and we were set. I mean, it cost a couple $1,000s, but it was worth it, because had we stayed there another 6 weeks, it would have cost at least that much, in room and board and all that. Yeah. So there's been a lot of new developments in terms of technology to help us dig. But in the end, you still have to come back and do what we call ground truthing. You have to see if what you've seen on the images really are there. So I'll give you a couple more short examples. At Cabri, we had done some remote sensing before we started digging, and we could see that there were walls and floors there, but it didn't give us any idea of depth. So we thought it was maybe 2 or 3 feet below. No, it turned out it was 6 feet below, and it took us almost 2 weeks to get down to it without ever finding anything in between, because the locals had brought in 2 meters of earth when they planted avocado orchards. So we had to ground truth. It turned out it worked. Similarly, a couple of years ago, they mentioned that in England they had found a new thing near Stonehenge that they called Superhenge, and they're like, oh, it's bigger, it's better. When they went to ground truth, it turned out that it wasn't quite what they expected. They had thought the stones were buried, and when they went and excavated, it turned out no, there were big, deposits there, but they were of like little pieces of stone. They weren't the big ones that they expected. So I've always told people that, whatever you think you see on a remote sensing image, go and dig, go and survey, go and ground truth before you hold a press conference. So be sure what you're claiming is in fact what you've got. So, but to your last question then, this does all provide new ways for people to do archaeology without necessarily having to become archaeologists and having to fight for the few jobs that there are out there. Because you can go into these other fields. You can become a specialist in remote sensing, in engineering, in doing LiDAR or whatever, and you can become one of the people that we lean on, that we depend on. Yes. Other people, doing radiocarbon, doing flora and faunal analysis, studying animal bones. There's tons of things you can do. No guarantee for jobs in any of them, but we now depend on, or we've always depended, but now really much so, on all these other disciplines to help us out. It really is, it's a multidisciplinary field now that goes into doing archaeology.
Yes, I think that answers my question, especially for the younger people who are thinking that there might be more jobs in archaeology now than there were, say, in my day. So that's good. That's answered that question. I wanted to move on to a favourite of mine, which is 1177. I think it's a favourite of millions of people. I noticed that one of your videos for 1177 had almost the entire population of New Zealand with the likes. I think that's something like 3.2 million people had pressed like. But I'd like to discuss it because in it you mention how the Bronze Age collapsed, but it also has parallels with today. And I was also interested, I think it was the Oriental Institute lecture that you had, and that you had a positive, not spin, but a positive conclusion to that. So that interests me. And also what I'm most interested in is your new book, which you're still writing after 1177. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about 1177. I think it also answers a question that a lot of people have, which is, what is the point of archaeology? Why would one want to engage in archaeology? But it does have an impact on today. So with that, would you just explain a little bit about 1177?
Sure. Yeah, and then go broad on that. Right. All right. So basically, what I study is the late Bronze Age, between 1500 and 1200 BC. So 3,500 years ago, everything was going great in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean and Egypt. Everybody's, talking with everybody else. Everybody's trading. They're exchanging gold from Egypt, tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus. And it's a very globalized, internationalized world for a couple of hundred years in a region, say, from Italy over to Afghanistan and Turkey down to Egypt in terms of today's countries. But round about 1177, just after 1200, everything suddenly collapses. Everything that they have been doing happily for 300 or 400 or 500 years, now suddenly in the space of just a couple of decades, 1 or 2 generations at most, everything comes crashing down. Why it happened is one of history's great mysteries. So that's what I set out to do in 1177. Again, Rob Tempio from Princeton asked me to write a book about the collapse and to figure out what happened, or our nearest best guess, because we can't be 100% sure. And so I told him, okay, fine, what I want to do, I'll write a book about the collapse, but I'm going to open and close the book with that. The whole middle part of the book, I want to write about what collapsed. Right. So I wanted to write about what happened in the 15th, 14th, 13th centuries, right? How was New Kingdom Egypt interacting with the Mycenaeans in Greece? You know, did King Tut actually know, like Agamemnon? You know, of course not, but never mind. But, you know, something like that. So I wanted to give people a sense of what it was like in the late Bronze Age, because that's as I said, that's like my absolute favorite period in any time of history. So what I did in the book was I went through the various explanations that people have suggested, ranging from the sea peoples, which the Egyptian pharaohs Merneptah and Ramses III left us inscriptions about, and they said they attacked Egypt. Egyptians defeated them, but they wreaked havoc in the rest of the Mediterranean. Others have suggested it was a series of earthquakes. Still others have suggested it was drought and famine, and so on. So I listed all of these, and I ended up, you know, spoiler alert here, I ended up concluding it was all of the above, that it was a perfect storm, that invaders aren't enough to bring down entire sets of interconnected civilizations. Same thing with earthquakes, drought, famine. But if you've got them all one after the other and piled on top of each other, you know, it's impossible to survive a drought, famine, earthquake, and invaders all at once. You just kind of throw up your hands and like, all right, I give up. Mm-hmm. So that was the conclusion I came to in the first edition of the book, which came out in about 2014. And yeah, I've given a series of lectures on it. It's, to my surprise, I mean, absolute surprise, this is a topic of interest to a lot of people. I never thought it would be. I thought it would be a specialized group, but there is a fascination out there, especially today, with collapse and collapse of civilizations. In fact, because a lot of people are worried that it's going to happen to our world today. And that's where I think the whole idea where archaeology and ancient history can become useful, because it shows what's happened in antiquity. It gives us lessons for what happened and how they either survived, adapted, or didn't survive and went down and are lost. So there are lessons to be learned there, beyond just, hey, this is really cool, look at this piece of gold I found. Mm. It's really, wow, what happened to, you know, the Maya, what happened to, and so on. So it kind of struck a chord, it resonated. Now, in the meantime, though, new discoveries were coming out just one after the other. And so round about 2018, 2019, I began pestering Rob, my editor, saying, I think it's time for a new edition. And he's like, well, have things changed? I said, they haven't really changed, but there's a lot of new data out there that supports what I was saying even more and makes it even more relevant to today. So he agreed to let me put out a revised edition, which just came out a month ago. And basically what happened is that there's a lot of new scientific studies that have come out showing that there was indeed drought back then. In fact, a drought that lasted between 150 and 300 years. Back in the first edition of the book, I had a couple of examples. I think it took up a page and a half. Now in the new edition, there's so many examples, it takes up 7, 8 pages just of example after example after example. And I even had to revise some of what I had said, because in the first book, first edition, I think I said Egypt was not that affected. Well, newsflash, it is affected.
Right.
There are differences in the Nile, floods and all that, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,000. So anyway, so the updated version has all of the new data in there, but there's also been some new tablets that have been published in the meantime, especially from the site of Ugarit up in North Syria. And there they are saying specifically there's famine in the city. They're also talking about invaders that have overrun their port city of Ras Ibn Hadi on the coast, and that they're now approaching Ugarit itself. Now, we know from the archaeology that Ugarit was torched, it's burned to the ground. So those invaders obviously got there. So I thought that it was time to put all this in. And then, as I was working on it, COVID hit, the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, we actually have almost everything that they had back then in terms of a perfect storm, right? We've got droughts and famines and invaders and you name it. But we also have one thing more now that they didn't have, because I haven't yet found any evidence for disease or pandemic as part of the actual collapse. I actually think it probably did happen, but no archaeological or written evidence for it so far. So that meant to me, when I got a little frazzled, I'm like, we have all the same conditions that they had when they were collapsing, and we've got one more. We've got a worldwide pandemic. And so what I did, you know, not to take advantage of people's fears, but to make it updated, instead of starting the book in 2013, which it had started with, now the new opening to the book is in 2020, and mentions the pandemic. So it was, I would say, a timely update, rather more timely than I had anticipated.
Yes.
But I was also able, because of the new data, I've actually changed my thinking at the end, where before I was hesitant to rank the different drivers or stressors, and I'm like, I don't know which one was more important. They were all important.
Yes.
Now, I mean, I'm definitely a child of our world. We're really afraid of climate change today, and that's the way I come down on it back in antiquity now. I say, out of all the different stressors, climate change seems to be the most important, and it led to the drought, which led to the famine, which led to people migrating. It, you know, wasn't quite that linear, obviously, was a lot more messier. But so in the revised edition, I stuck myself into the book, which I hadn't done in the first edition, and I end up saying, I believe this. You can disagree with me, but this is what I think. And the feedback I've gotten so far is people are a little bit happier with the fact that I've actually come out and said what I think, you know, instead of remaining this, you know, on the sideline saying, well, here's the facts, you decide for yourself. Now I've said, here's what I think. And so that's where the next book comes from that you referred to, because I'm working on the sequel. And the sequel is simply called After 1177, and it deals with the next 400 or so years after the collapse. What happened? Of the different groups that collapsed, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, who survived and who didn't? And of the ones that survived, what did they do to become resilient, to make it through? And of the ones that didn't survive, what didn't they do? How did they not adapt? So, you know, the Hittites, they don't survive, they go away. A little subgroup keeps going as the Neo-Hittites, but they don't survive. Mycenaeans don't survive, but the Neo-Assyrians do. The Egyptians do. The Cypriots do. So what do each of them, how did they fare? What did they do? And what I'm finding, somewhat to my surprise, but also not so much, that it is a lesser era, right? Less socio-complex, less politically complex, but not nearly as dark as most general history books would have you think. And
Right.
this is something that has long been known to archaeologists, that, yeah, it's not as dark, but a bit to my surprise, there's so much new information. It's not anywhere close to being dark. There is so much going on. They
Right.
are still interconnected, but at a different lower level. And we've got new players on the scene. So, for example, the Phoenicians,
Mhm.
they walk in and they take advantage of all the chaos.
Right.
And, I mentioned Ugarit was burnt to the ground. That
Yes.
stopped them. And Phoenicians seem to take advantage of that.
Right.
So I'm having a lot of fun researching and writing it right now.
Yes.
I was thinking for a while of putting it as a series of case studies. This is what happened to the Egyptians. This is what happened to the Assyrians. This is what happened to the Cypriots. And I thought, actually, I think it'll be more interesting for people if I do it chronologically, like I did in 1177,
Right.
and do 12th century, 11th century, 10th century, 9th century, and ending in the 8th century, so people can kind of follow how it goes down and then comes back up, but also can still see the interrelations, because that's, for me, is what is fascinating, is how the people are still interacting
Yes.
and doing diplomatic things, even when they're at their lowest ebb. So I think I'm going to go chronological rather than case studies, but
Yes.
we'll see. I'm only about halfway through researching and writing it.
Right.
May yet change my mind again, so would be interested in feedback as to what people think would work best. But so it probably won't be out until about 2023, maybe.
Oh,
But definitely, yeah, it'll take a while, but definitely, just like people are worried and wondering about collapse today, they're also worried and wondering about resilience. If
yes.
we do collapse, what will it take to come back? So I'm thinking that this might be a timely sequel as
Yes.
well, but
Yes.
we shall see. If we do collapse, I'm going to have to write faster. But
Oh, thank you so much. I think one of the things I loved about 1177 is that there was a positive side to it, and I think that people are actually wanting to learn about what's happening, but also to believe in something positive as an
yeah,
outcome to everything that we're going through. So I look forward to the book, and
yes,
I hope it comes out sooner rather than later.
I hope so too. But in the interim, though, you will be interested, and the younger viewers will be interested too. We're also trying to reach a new audience, and so I've teamed up with Glynis Fox, who did the illustrations for Three
Yes.
Stones Make a Wall.
Yes.
She is writing a graphic history of
Yes.
1177 aimed at younger readers, and
Yes.
so that will be out before the sequel comes out. So
Excellent.
that will be fun to see that too.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for talking with me today and for giving the time, especially with the time difference that we have. And I'll just stop the recording now and probably just have a bit of a
Thank
chat with you. But we seem to have
Yes,
hit
thank you
the
so
half hour.
much.
Thank you.